Welcome to the Fear and Greed Daily Interview. I'm Sean Aylmer. I've spoken a lot on the podcast, more than I'd like, about money laundering. In recent years, there have been some very high-profile cases. In 2018, Commonwealth Bank was fined $700 million by financial crime watchdog Austrac over almost 54,000 breaches of anti-money laundering laws. This was then dwarfed by Westpac, which admitted to breaching the Anti-Money Laundering and Counter-Terrorism Financing Act more than 23 million times. The bank was fined $1.3 billion, the largest civil penalty in Australian corporate history. Money laundering again raised its head during the Bergen inquiry into whether Crown Casino should be given a licence to run a casino in New South Wales, with hundreds of millions of dollars allegedly laundered by organised crime groups through the country's casinos. I wanted today to delve into the world of financial crime and get a clearer idea of what money laundering is, how companies leave themselves open to it, and how to prevent it. Scott Mandell is the Oceania Financial Crime Advisory Services Leader at EY, with 2 decades of experience in fraud detection and anti-money laundering. Scott, welcome to Fear and Greed.
Hi, Sean. Thanks for having me.
Can you give me a definition of money laundering, a simple one?
Yeah, so money laundering is a term used to describe a number of techniques in which essentially funds, properties, or that are obtained through illegal or criminal activities are then converted into assets in such a way that we're concealing the true origin or owner of those funds that would indicate some level of irregularity. The main objective of money laundering is to legitimize income that's originating from illegitimate sources. So in short, it's making dirty money clean. Money launderers themselves are often sophisticated criminals who change their MO, and ultimately the goal, whether it's a dishonest businessman or a drug kingpin, is to deposit the assets into a financial institution without drawing attention to themselves.
Okay, so without any allegations of guilt or anything here, if there's a casino group, is it money that's illegally obtained through whatever means? Let's say it's $1 million. Is the idea that it's laundered through a casino because they know if you put $1 million through a slot machine or whatever, the odds are you get 500,000 back, 700,000 back, and then that legitimizes the money? Is that how it works?
Yeah, essentially, that's right from an example perspective, Sean. I mean, there's 3 main steps to the method around money laundering. It's placement, layering, and integration. So with placement, it's when the proceeds of a criminal offense, in your example, $1 million, enter into the financial system. You say a casino, obviously could be a bank or a number of other facilities. Layering then happens through a series of transactions where it's essentially distancing the original source of the funds from the ultimate destination. So right there, you use an example of putting it into slot machines. It could be through a series of sophisticated financial transactions. But again, it's putting space between where it originally came from and where it's going. And then ultimately, the last step is that integration, and it's getting those proceeds out of the financial system and allowing for seemingly innocent purchases to happen thereon.
So in most cases, it's not really the companies themselves that are doing it. It's outsiders effectively using the company's facilities.
Sean, I would say you're exactly right. In most cases, companies are unknowingly being used to support these nefarious actions. And while there are certainly deliberate acts by a particular party, there's an art of deception that's being used by these actors that's meant to circumvent oversight and controls that these organizations have in place meant to detect these transactions.
Okay. I mean, and then the other example, and I'm going to start thinking about Breaking Bad here, which is, I probably shouldn't do that, but in that show, they actually bought a car wash business, and the idea was that they had illegally obtained money, and they were doing it themselves. The point of the story is they were doing it themselves. They were saying that they washed 1,000 cars a day when actually they only washed 100, and that way they effectively laundered the money.
That's right. Yeah, it's interesting. And one of the things we had discussed kind of before this recording is the idea of, well, who are some of those main perpetrators for money laundering? And interestingly, I mean, one of the challenges of identifying money launderers is knowing who to look for, because there's no specific type of money launderer. You can't just look it up in the dictionary. And while, yes, Breaking Bad, Ozark, those types of shows do end up kind of talking about ways where it's a lot more clear from an organized crime perspective, generally speaking, the perpetrators range from political corruption, drug sales, human trafficking. We've been seeing a lot of news about even theft and the financing of terrorism.
Wow. It's a pretty dirty industry.
It is. It is indeed.
Are we seeing more of it these days, or are we just more globalized, or are we better at detecting it? What's the story there?
Yeah, I think it's a little of both, Sean. Companies are increasingly focused on proactively preventing being used to facilitate this activity. And that comes from the regulatory pressure that's been out there, but also the reputational risks that result in being seen as being party to this. And as a result, they've invested a lot of resources, time, and money to detect things as early as possible. However, criminals are equally increasing their level of sophistication, and it is difficult to keep up. This is only exacerbated further as we move into a more digital economy where transactions are happening quickly, in fact, as close as real time, which makes detection, by its definition, is post an event happening, becoming just as important as prevention.
Scott, stay with me. We'll be right back. I'm talking to Scott Mandell, Financial Crime Advisory Services Leader at EY. So I suppose what it means, and if you think of the Commonwealth Bank and Westpac in particular with this, in both those cases, I don't think, no one within the bank was doing anything willfully wrong, but it does show just how important getting the right systems in place are and keeping those systems up to date.
That's correct. That's correct. And with the scale and speed, it's no longer enough to just have people. You've got to have tools and technology that allow for reducing the volume that the individuals would be looking through, but also applying a level of sophistication and analysis that the human brain just can't compute at that speed.
Yeah, okay. Is mostly organised crime groups, is that right, that involved in money laundering? Or is it's not state-sponsored is what I'm trying to get to?
Yeah, no, that's correct. That's certainly an example, but it can be for any number of purposes. And what's also interesting is the facilities that they're using for that. I alluded to earlier that it's not just banks that are a part of this. And you had mentioned casinos. If you look at AUSTRAC's remit, so AUSTRAC is the Australian government agency that's responsible for detecting and deterring criminal abuse of the financial system. And they ask questions around, do you have gaming machines? Right? Do you offer money transfer services? Do you offer digital currency, crypto exchange? Are you a motor vehicle dealer and offering insurance? Are you a solicitor? I mean, all of these are different methods by which any number of actors can use the financial system for money laundering purposes.
Okay, do we have a sense of how big it is?
It's a great question, Sean, and I think the short answer is no. We've got views certainly of the materiality as it's related to things that have been caught. But what's interesting about money laundering is its difference from things like fraud. So in fraud, you know that something is being done to defraud an organization, and you can take that example and use it and know that if you see it again, it's most likely fraud. Money laundering, because it's talking about using the financial system as a conduit, it's very, very difficult to know what things are happening before they get into the system, and then once they are out, what they are being used for. So it makes for a complex web of knowing who customers are before you engage with them, what is happening with those transactions within the financial system, and then also partnering very closely with law enforcement agencies so that when things happen post using of those funds, we can circle back on identifying whether that is a trend that we would want to pay attention to later.
Okay, and is this a cash issue or is it a digital issue? And where I'm heading there is with cryptocurrencies, whether that has any role in it.
Yeah, look, I think it's a fair observation. In short, no, it's not just about cash. If we go back to the definition, it's about taking some level of assets, concealing its origin, and bringing it back out into another usable form. And so as we're becoming more digital, as we're becoming more global, it's easier than ever for people to be able to conceal the true intentions of some of the assets that they have. And so the importance here is understanding that fundamental principle of what is a legitimate transaction for a particular person to be able to have a baseline to measure against whether that's something that would be out of the ordinary or an anomaly.
Okay. And has the pandemic made any difference because everyone's gone online?
Yes, that's right. I'd say Firstly, you have seen a fuel in things like e-commerce, but also other non-traditional ways of facilitating transactions. And so that means that there's been a market shift in how people transact, so that what we may have determined to be an anomaly before is actually very standard today, or vice versa. And so as a result, companies are having to deal with having to revisit what normal looks like. And again, this is where tools and technologies are critical to analyzing the data that exists to determine what is an anomaly versus what is just a new way of doing business.
That makes it very difficult for the companies and, in a sense, opens up opportunities for the criminals.
That's correct. That's correct. It is a fastly evolving area.
We'll be back with more in a moment. My guest today is EY's Financial Crime Advisory Services leader, Scott Mandell. The fines for breaches of anti-money laundering laws are huge, and we mentioned them before. Westpac got hit with this $1.3 billion fine. Westpac was at fault because its systems weren't up to speed, but there was nothing malicious. Westpac didn't deliberately set out to do something. Do we ever get to find the people laundering the money?
Fascinating question. How do we get to find the people? I mean, at that stage, it turns over into a law enforcement discussion and really trying to understand what is it, what are some of those illicit activities that we had referenced before, organized crime, political corruption, drugs, human trafficking, that this would be using to facilitate. And so it tends to end up being a support for criminal investigations.
Yeah, okay. So these fines, do you think they're big enough to make a difference? $1.3 billion is a lot of money, so I'm sure that made a difference at Westpac. But generally, are the fines big enough to make a difference?
Yeah, look, there's certainly been the recent fines locally here in Australia, but even globally, if you look at some of the things that have been happening in North America, in Europe, and in broader Asia Pac, have certainly thrust these laws and regulations into the spotlight. But I think it's important to appreciate that the seriousness by which these organizations have been taking it, that there's a need to continue to constantly challenge the status quo of how they're managing this risk. Most organizations have significant operations that are focused solely on anti-money laundering and financial crime. And these functions are staffed with hundreds of people of varying backgrounds. They come from banking operations, they're technology architects, they're law enforcement officers, and even now more so, they're data analysts. But the reality is that this is a complex field with highly motivated, intelligent, and frankly, well-funded foes, right? So money launderers are constantly evolving to stay one step ahead. And it's important that companies try to keep pace.
Okay, and so at EY, Scott, you're the lead of the Financial Crime Advisory Services. That means that you consult to businesses about how they should behave in terms of systems and processes and that type of thing. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right, John. One of the areas we try to bring value is in making sure that organizations understand what their role is, how the obligations that they are required to meet, and how they should go about doing that. The other place is around learning from others, because as we had discussed before, this is not a unique issue to Australia. It's something that everybody has been facing across the globe. And so bringing in the thought leadership and the effort that people have put in, organizations have put in and invested from other areas of the globe is really, really critical to allow Australia to continue to jump that S-curve as it relates to their maturity in this space. Because again, the criminals that are trying to use these organizations are constantly evolving themselves.
Scott, thanks for talking to Fear and Greed.
Sean, thank you again.
That was Scott Mandell, Financial Crime Advisory Services leader at EY.